Hello fellow armchair detectives, it's Caroline Mitchell here. I am a crime thriller author and ex-police detective, and this week I'm bringing you the case of a notorious killer couple nicknamed the Barbie and Ken Killers. You won't want to miss this one. So this week we're talking about the case of Bernardo and Karla Homolka, nicknamed the Barbie and Ken Killers, because they look more suited to the cover of OK magazine than people who should be behind bars. When I researched this case, it was chilling, and I found a lot of similarities to Fred and Rosemary West. It's hard to believe that a glamorous, young, wealthy couple like this could go on to commit so many heinous crimes, and the most shocking of all, against Karla's younger sister. So Paul was described as a happy little boy to the outside world. He was like a little cherub with his fair hair and dimples and blue eyes, always had a smile for everyone. His family weren't badly off for money. They lived in a nice house in a nice neighbourhood. But behind closed doors there lay a darker, more sinister tale. His father was abusive towards his mother, and his mother used to sink into deep depressions which could last for days. And it was only when he was 16 that Paul discovered that his mum had had an affair with her first love, and he was the result of that. So the man that he had grown up with, treating as his father for 16 years, wasn't his dad at all, and that hit Paul hard. Now, he had grown up watching his father be abusive towards his mother, treat her badly, call her names, make fun of her, and it seemed like the norm for him. And it wasn't just that. Paul's father was charged with molesting young girls, and when Paul's sister was little, his dad would be seen to be peeping through her bedroom window when she was getting dressed and undressed. The family would hear her cry out, but nothing was done. And this quickly became the norm for Paul. So he started abusing his mother, calling her names and calling her a whore for having affairs. And she reacted to this by just withdrawing from the world. She moved down into the basement where she lived on a mattress on the floor. She took food and hid it downstairs, but didn't buy food for the family. When Paul invited friends or family back to the house, they were shocked that there was no food in the fridge. Outwardly, the family looked okay, but really it was very far from that. As time progressed, Paul's mum got in touch with her biological sisters because she had been adopted from an early age. All of her siblings had been adopted by her parents. They had given them up without any explanation, and perhaps this also affected her. But she moved out, and she would sometimes come home and move back and forward. She was a bit of a part-time mother. Paul went to college, and he was fascinated by motivational talks and books and lines, and he used to use these chat-up lines. Now, he was a good-looking lad, but his relationships did not last very long, because soon after he sweet-talked them, he would become rough with them, he would become abusive, and he had unusual tastes in sex which frightened a lot of them off. He treated women with little respect, and his favourite book was American Psycho. He was a troubled boy, an even more troubled adult, who would go on to commit the most atrocious crimes. There's been so many documentaries about Karla and Paul, and a lot of them claim that Karla had a happy life. Karla liked drawing, and she loved animals, or so it seems. She had a part-time job in a pet shop. She would go on later on to work for veterinary practice. But I don't know, because if you delve a little deeper into her past, apparently she threw her friend's hamster out the window, attaching a pillowcase to its back and tying it up to see if it could fly. Later on, after the hamster was buried, she dug it up to see how it had decomposed. And this already reveals quite a dark side about this young child. She had a very high IQ in school, and she was well liked by her teachers because she was a bit of a perfectionist. She liked everything to be just right. But she was bossy, and her friends would claim when they went round there to play Barbies with her, everything had to be as she said, otherwise she would sulk for days. When she was 12, she became fascinated by true crime. She loved Nancy Drew and the Hardy mysteries, but she became really interested in it and would fantasize about different types of crimes. Then as she became older, people said she really developed a dark, mean streak. She would always play tricks on her friends. She enjoyed frightening them. She liked seeing people afraid, maybe powerless. She became interested in the occult as she began to cut herself, ink herself, and fantasize about weird ways to cut people up and put them through pain. This was long before she met Paul, who she claimed ruled the roost. During her high school days, she was very confident with the opposite sex. She fantasized about weird situations involving death and torture. Karla was at a pet shop convention when she met Paul. She was 17 and she was in a hotel room with her friend, and they were hungry, and she was wearing her pyjamas and decided to go down to the hotel to get a quick bite to eat before bed. And they were chatting amongst themselves, and Paul and his friend walked in. There was an instant attraction. I mean, like, boom, fireworks. And the boys came over to the girl's table. He was 23 and he had no hesitation in chatting her up. And I think his chat line was, did she always go out to eat in her pyjamas? Which made her laugh. So they got talking. There must have been a vibe between them. But she brought him back to her hotel room. Even though her friend was there, she didn't care, and they had sex. After that, they became really, really close really quickly, and within a couple of months they were engaged. And Karla's family welcomed Paul with open arms. They called him the perfect weekend son because he was always there. And in the home videos they made, of which there are many, they seemed like such a happy, carefree couple. But behind the mask lay what Paul himself would come to term as deadly innocence. Between 1987 and 1990, Paul raped 10 girls and attempted to rape 6 more, but that's only that we know of. We believe there have been many, many more. When the police managed to get an artist's sketch of the suspect and released it, it was so similar to Paul that 2 of his friends rang the police to tell them. He was interviewed, he was brought in and spoken to about it, vehemently denied it, and laughed about it, saying, "Look at me, why would I want to rape someone? I can have any woman I want." And he didn't seem to fit the profile of the person they were looking for. This person was a peeping Tom, someone who would hide in the bushes, someone who would hunt around bus stops and lone women in car parks, and even in the backyard of their own homes. This didn't seem like this handsome young boy with the world at his feet. And there have been other videos where people would say, oh, the police were so stupid, how would they let him persuade them that he was innocent of this? It doesn't come down to persuasion though. You might have your opinions, but at the end of the day, it's evidence. It doesn't come down to them being persuaded or not. It comes down to pure evidence. And if you don't have the evidence, then there's not a lot you can do until you get it. Back then, investigation techniques were different. It was so much harder. DNA testing had literally just come onto the forefront. There weren't enough people to do it, and there wasn't enough of a budget. And also, everything was handwritten. Not like now when there's computers and everything's typed on and there's no notes going missing, no pieces of paper that can't be shared elsewhere. Everything now is on computers, but back then everything was filed, which meant sharing was more difficult. Who knows with some of these crimes how quickly they could have been solved if it was present day. But Paul became more arrogant with each crime he got away with and began to listen to his own narrative that he was untouchable. His relationship never lasted long until he met Karla, and then he found his soulmate because she had the same dark thoughts and interests as him. So Paul provided a DNA sample to police when they asked for it. It would take 2 years for the DNA results to come back. The Centre for Testing had a low budget and only 2 technicians available to do them. The Scarborough Rapes came to a sudden halt when Paul and Karla moved in with her family in St. Catharines. Karla had 2 sisters, but it was her youngest sister, Tammy, who took an instant shine to Paul. It was a schoolgirl crush, and his feelings for her became very strong, and the pair of them spent a lot of time together. He would take her out places, go shopping with her, buy her things, and they would giggle and laugh. Now Karla, I think, didn't like this. Although on one hand she definitely seemed to encourage it, but it was only because that's where she held her power. She didn't like them going off together without her. She wanted to control it. If she could control what happened, then that was okay. Paul believed that Karla was a virgin when they met, and when she opened up to him and told him she wasn't, he was really, really annoyed. So he then turned it on Tammy, saying that she would give him the virginity that Karla was unable to. It seems crazy, right? And most women would be out of there at this stage. It's her little sister he's talking about. But oh no, Karla had different things in mind. Karla encouraged this and said that As long as she was instigating it and she was in charge, then that was fine. She called him her king. Paul was her king and she was his slave, and it was always the two of them against the world, and she wanted nothing to break that up. So she took the blinds off Tammy's window so he could watch her dress and undress just like his father did with his daughter years before. Sometimes he would go into her room when she was asleep, and once Karla stole drugs from the veterinary centre from where she worked, crushed them and put them in her little sister's food to make sure she stayed asleep as Paul crept in the night and masturbated next to her. Karla fueled Paul's fantasy by dressing up as Tammy when she wasn't there, and they used to have sex on her bed. And she'd call herself Tammy, saying she wanted him to take her virginity. Things became more heated, and the couple devised a plan. On Christmas Eve, when Karla's parents were gone to bed, they slipped sleeping pills into alcohol while they spent time in the recreational room and filmed everything. Paul was fascinated by filming with a camera Karla had bought him from her credit card, and when Tammy had passed out, their plan elevated. Karla covered Tammy's face with a halothane-soaked cloth. It was a drug she'd got from the veterinary centre to help keep her little sister unconscious while Paul raped her. They took turns holding the camera while she got involved too, and they made a home movie out of this despicable crime. But things were to take a darker turn as Tammy began to cough and choke on her own vomit. They panicked, quickly getting dressed, quickly hiding what they'd used, and she was brought to the hospital, but she died in the early hours of Christmas morning. They came up with this cover story and said that she'd been drinking heavily and they'd heard a noise, went up to see what it was, and she was choking on her own vomit. There was a burn on her face from the halothane, and they said that was just a carpet burn where they had dragged her onto the floor to try and resuscitate her, and they seemed to get away with it. The drugs were not picked up in Tammy's system. Sometimes it can be a matter of the body being tested for a basic variety of drugs where they don't test for anything more detailed because they're simply not looking for it. The story seemed plausible. It was Christmas, it was a time when people drank too much, and it wouldn't be the first case of a young girl choking on her own vomit from too much alcohol. I mean, who would ever imagine that a sister could help her boyfriend rape a young girl like that? It was unthinkable. A month later, the couple moved out of the family home to allow Karla's parents time to grieve, and things just got worse from there. Tammy's death did not teach them a lesson. If anything, it just fueled them. They got away with that. So what else could they get away with? And in the comfort of their own home, who knew what they could get up to? Paul and Karla soon became a powerful killing duo. She acted as his submissive, but she was really at the heart of it all and helped organise things as she stole more and more drugs from the veterinary centre where she worked. On June 15th, 1991, the following year, Leslie Mahaffey had been to a funeral home with her friends for a schoolboy that had died in a car accident. She went to the woods with her school friends and they all had a drink to drown their sorrows. They stayed there till about 2 a.m. and Leslie went home and her friends walked her to the door. The side door was closed, but she told them to go. It was okay. She said, "I'm fine, the front door will be open." They never imagined that her parents would lock her out, but they did, to teach her a lesson for breaking her curfew. Leslie went and phoned a friend. She had to walk down the road to do it because she didn't have a mobile phone back then. So she phoned one of her friends and asked if she could sleep over. And after a lengthy conversation of about half an hour, her friend said no. So Leslie returned home, telling herself that she would wake her mother and get in and just face the music. But as she approached her house, she saw Paul casing the house next door. She said to him, "What are you doing?" And he laughed and said, "Oh, I'm going to break in." And she seemed to take this on the chin, maybe thinking he was joking. He asked her if she would like a cigarette, and she said yes, and she went back to his car to get one. But then he bundled her in the car and drove back to where he lived with Karla. Karla was awoken to find Leslie in her house, and the pair of them tortured and sexually abused her for hours, filming the whole thing. They disposed of her dismembered body parts by encasing them in bags of concrete that Paul had bought, and they then dumped them in a nearby lake. On June 29th, the same day Paul and Karla got married, Leslie's body parts were found encased in concrete blocks in Lake Gibson. So the following year, on April the 16th in 1992, Kristen French was walking home from school. She had always arrived home on time and she had a regular routine. Paul and Karla stopped in the car to ask her for directions. The girl started trying to help Karla as she got out of the car and pulled out a map, but she didn't see Paul creeping up behind her, and the two of them bundled her into the car. This was in broad daylight in front of everyone. They had become so arrogant because of everything they had gotten away with before that. So Karla held her down while Paul drove back to their house, and a shoe was left behind at the scene. Several witnesses saw what happened and reported it straight away to the police. And Kristen's parents knew straight away that when their child didn't come home, something was desperately wrong. But the reports by witnesses were a false lead, and they gave the wrong description of the car. And I know it seems crazy, but this really does happen. This is why witnesses are always interviewed separately by the police, because you can have such a varying account, especially with a traumatic event. Your mind doesn't always remember things as clearly as you think it does. So sadly, this would hold back the police more than anything, as they put up big posters of this car that really didn't match the description of Paul and Karla's car at all. Kristen was raped, beaten and tortured by the couple over a prolonged period of time. Karla gave her a teddy to hold between attacks. They took turns in filming and holding the camera as always. Kristen was later strangled by Paul. They washed her body and disposed of it, dumping it just 500 yards from where Leslie's grave was. They'd shaved her hair. Most people think this was an act of humiliation for the young girl, but they said later on that it was to stop them identifying who she was. Kristen's naked body was found in a ditch just yards from Leslie's burial place. But the couple's relationship became darker and darker as they argued and fought. Paul was seeing other women and he was so blatant about it. And there was a movie of the couple called Karla, and I did watch it, and it just made me feel icky throughout. It also placed Karla as a victim, which I did not believe for a second. But there was one point in the movie that I thought, oh my God, where she's in the house and he comes back and she says, oh, hi babe, what are you up to? And he goes, hi babe, I've just been out raping women. And she's like, oh, okay. And you just think, how warped. And would they have been quite as bad if they had never met? It does seem like a dynamic between these couples who just water meets its own level, as they say, who just get together and just, it's hard to imagine how anyone could do the things they did. And Karla would later say that it made her sad because, especially with Kristen and Leslie, that they had become friends and she talked to them about girl things, and she was sad when they died, even though the videos quite clearly showed her as a willing participant.
He kept saying, go through what we're going to do. So I said, well, if we see a girl, we're going to stop. I'm gonna ask her for directions. I'm going to try and get her over to the car. So he wanted her right beside him so he could hold the knife to her. And I sat in the back seat, actually more in the middle of the front seats, and I held her hair and I held her head down. I never should have gotten to know Kristen, because you get emotionally involved with these people and it really hurts. It hurts a lot more because I felt like I was friends with both of them, especially Kristen, because we did so much stuff together. We put makeup on together. We talked, just girl talk when Paul was gone getting us food, and it just made it hurt even more. I said, well, we have to go to my parents for Easter dinner. And he said, well, why don't we just not go? And I said, well, I don't think it would look very good. I mean, we're supposed to go to my parents for Easter dinner and we don't go. And I said, well, how's it going to look if, this girl's missing and we have no alibi? We haven't gone anywhere, we haven't done anything. And he said, well, I guess you're right. And because he wanted to keep her for longer. And I didn't want to. I was going to work. I didn't want to go to work knowing that this girl was in my house and she could escape so easily. And I was afraid. So I didn't suggest to him that we kill her on Sunday, but I knew that she I knew that she had to be gone.
The victim was matter-of-fact when she toured police through her Bayview Avenue home where 2 teenagers were murdered. She had chosen to dress as a schoolgirl. Homolka's response to being back in one of the rooms where Leslie Mahaffey was attacked was to ask police about her furniture.
Can you answer a question for me? Was any of the furniture damaged as a result of the investigation?
Not that I'm aware of, no.
Okay, good, so I'm asking for.
And upstairs in the bathroom where they cleansed Kristen French's body of evidence, Homolka inquired after her perfume samples.
But I don't have any of that stuff.
So where are all those articles from?
Where Paul's lawyer took them.
You're saying Paul's lawyer took a number of articles from you?
Well, from what I understand, his lawyer took basically everything. This is where we carried Leslie down the stairs.
And in the basement where Leslie Mahaffey was dismembered, she had yet another inquiry on behalf of her other sister, Lori.
Can I ask you a question?
I'm afraid I can't answer.
Can I have that book? My sister wants it. Or does that have to stay here?
That has to stay for now,
Okay.
but we can make those arrangements.
Okay, thank you.
Paul and Karla's relationship began to just spiral out of control. Paul regularly bet Karla, but he was becoming more and more violent, pushing things further. He had affairs with other women and he was very blatant about it. He would even have parties where he would get off with other women while his wife was upstairs, and none of his friends could believe what he was doing right under her nose. Paul would beat and rape his wife, just as he did with the girls that he murdered. And one night he bet her so viciously with a torch that she needed hospitalization. But it took several bad beatings for her to get the courage to actually leave the relationship. And she went home to her family and she confessed all. Then, armed with lawyers, she went to the police and she made a plea deal. Karla blamed everything on Paul, said that she was a victim of domestic abuse and that he engineered everything and she was too scared to say no. Everything was his idea and she was just an innocent victim that had no choice but to go along with things because she was forced into it. So the police accepted her plea deal and she was sentenced to 12 years in prison. But it was only after, when they found the footage of their disturbing home movies, that it became very clear that Karla was very much a driving force behind the crimes. But the footage took its time coming to light. The police had a 3-month warrant to search Paul's house when he was arrested, and even then they couldn't find the tapes. The DNA came back, thankfully showing that he was indeed the Scarborough Rapist, and he was charged with those offences. Police had a warrant to search Paul's house, and it lasted 3 months, and they basically turned the place inside out, but they could not find those tapes. And it was only when Paul's lawyer got a phone call from his client that he went to the house and knew exactly where to find them. They were in a light fitting in the bedroom. And he took the tapes and did not give them in to the police. So they stayed with him for a year until Paul got a new lawyer. And they were handed over to him and he handed them into the police. So the old lawyer was charged with obstruction for holding on to them for so long because they made such a difference. Karla, for one, would not have got off so easily. And there was public uproar about this, saying that they did a deal with the devil, as indeed they did. So on July 6, 1993, Karla was sentenced to 12 years in prison. On September the 1st, 1995, Paul was found guilty of all 9 counts against him. 2 counts each of the first-degree murder, kidnapping, forcible confinement and aggravated sexual assault. 1 count of committing an indignity to a human body. He was sentenced to life imprisonment and declared a dangerous offender and would unlikely receive parole. In 2006, Paul confessed of at least 10 more sexual assaults. But when he was with Karla, he bragged about at least 30 that he had committed. Lots of photos were found of him with other women at his premises. We may never know the true extent of his crimes. So a little extra insight on Karla. Her parole review stated that Karla is highly artificial, articulate, manipulative, egocentric if not narcissistic, whose behaviour cannot be explained solely on the basis of intimidation or abuse by Paul Bernardo. So Paul made his first pitch for parole in 2018 after 25 years in prison, and thankfully it was turned down. He said that he knew the real reasons behind his crimes. He said his childhood was made more difficult because of a condition he was born with, in which his tongue was fixed to the floor of his mouth, and he had trouble communicating, and he did have a small operation that assisted him with that. He said his problem stemmed from low self-esteem, misguided coping mechanisms, and cognitive distortions, and the disinhibitory effects of stress and alcohol. He said these were the psychological reasons behind his atrocious crimes. He said, "This is why I offended in the first place. It's always hard to express what I was feeling. I felt inadequate." He is a no-contact offender and spends most of his day in his cell. He was described in court as eager, agreeable, strangely docile and unfocused. It is unlikely he will ever be released. So where is Karla now? Well, Karla was described as having an IQ of 132, which means she was a very intelligent lady. She served her time in prison and was released in 2005. She got married to her lawyer's brother, had 3 children, and started her life again. She changed her name a couple of times because people were trying to keep track of her and reported it if they did see her out and about. And there was uproar when she was found volunteering at her children's school. And who would blame parents for that? Someone like that, in my opinion, should be on the sex offenders register. According to the psychiatrist, her actions represented those of a psychopath and not of a victim. She's said to have had the condition, and I'm trying to pronounce this, hybristophilia, where a woman is aroused by a partner who is dominant and violent during sexual acts. It's also a term used for women who marry serial killers or lifers in prison. And I know I've kind of not gone into great detail on every single victim because I would be here forever. And also it's very harrowing reading what they did to them. I know I've kind of only spoken about 3 in particular. And there were so many more victims, and God love the people who were brave enough to come forward and give their account. It must have been so difficult for the people in court as well, for the jury who had to listen to the videotapes. Apparently they just listened to the sound, they didn't watch, and that the judge did order that as soon as the tapes were used in court they were to be destroyed, and rightly so. It's horrific to imagine that people had to relive those moments with the victims. And always more shocking when a woman's involved. I mean, to start off with her own little sister and do that to her and let it happen, and for it to continue on and on and on again, for her husband to go out and she knowing he's out raping women and quite happy to sit back and let that happen and even bring them back to her. So no, I don't believe she was a victim in all of this. There were times when she could have called the police, she could have stopped him, and she chose not to because she was a wholehearted participant. So what do you think? Do you think Karla has learned her lesson and served her time and should be allowed to get on with her life? Do you feel that it was all Paul's fault, that he was the driving force behind it, or do you think that they did it together? I'd love to hear your thoughts on this. Thank you so much for joining me. I really appreciate it. This is a new channel that I'm getting off the ground, so every like and every subscription means the world to me. My little disclaimer also is in the box below to say that these cases are not ones I've dealt with in my career as a police detective. They come from information that I have found in the public domain. And don't let these things worry you. They are very, very unusual. So sleep soundly in your bed tonight.